Everybody, it's me, Ken Heckenlively, with the show Twice as Lively. Welcome to this broadcast in which I ask the question, what we do in life, does it echo in eternity? Yes, I'm going to be talking about three men who had major influences on my life and what we might be able to learn from those experiences. But as always, in memorial of our dear fallen leader, Scott Adams, who taught us that the simultaneous sip is one of the glorious experiences of the day. So please find your beverage of choice. Hopefully, since it is early in the day, it is a non alcoholic drink. But if it does happen to contain alcohol, I will make no judgments upon you. So get ready for that simultaneous sip. Here we go. Ah, so delicious, so delicious. And so important because as I'm on here for 30 or 40 minutes, sometimes my throat will get a little bit dry, which is why some coffee with that wonderful caffeine is just the stimulant that I need. All right, so for some of my older listeners, this may be a wonderful, nostalgic episode. And hopefully, for some of my younger viewers, it will be educational as you will learn about some great men of the past and the lessons that I take away from them. Okay, man number one is Johnny Carson. So, my younger viewers may not know how big Johnny Carson and The Tonight Show was, but let me just explain how I came to know Johnny Carson and then what I found out later about my family's connection to this man who at the time was arguably the most famous man in America. So for me, Johnny Carson starts with that warm feeling of home because while my dad and my brother tended to go to sleep early at night, usually going to sleep by about 9 o'clock, my mom and I were both night owls. And she was always very interested in the news. And so we would always watch the 11 o'clock news. And then after the 11 o'clock news would come The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson at 11:30. And Johnny always opened his shows with a monologue talking about the day's events. And then he would segue into having his guests, who were some of the most popular people in America. Now, usually what I would do is I would watch the Johnny Carson show with my mom. We would watch the monologue, and then maybe the first two guests or so get to be about 10 after midnight. And my mom and I would both say, okay, now is time to go to sleep. So what I enjoyed so much about Johnny Carson was he reminded me so much of my father. He just had that easy Midwestern charm. At the end of his monologue, he would usually do a kind of golf swing, practice golf swing. My dad was a big golfer. So imagine me spending many years having that wonderful experience of watching Johnny Carson, thinking how much he reminded me of my dad. And maybe when I was about 12 or 13 years old, my dad started telling me many stories about Johnny Carson. And something I didn't realize is that the Heckenlively family and the Carson family were good friends. So my dad grew up in Norfolk, Nebraska, as did Johnny Carson. Johnny Carson was about 4 or 5 years older than my dad. But the Carson and Heckenlively families knew each other. And so Johnny Carson, you may not know this, but he was drafted during World War II, or served in the Navy actually in World War II. And so he was away during the war. My dad was just young enough that he missed being in World War II. But when the vets were released from military service, they generally went back to the colleges. And so even though Johnny Carson and my dad were separated by a couple years, they both went to the University of Nebraska at Lincoln at the same time. And so my dad actually grew up knowing the Carson family. And then when he went to the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, he uh, he would go to watch Carson's college shows. And Carson was actually a DJ on the radio station there. And my dad told this story to me about how when he was at the University of Nebraska, his parents came to visit him. And it was apparently the same weekend that Johnny Carson's parents came to visit him. And for some reason, it was never really clear to me, the Carson and Heckenlively parents got together for dinner with Johnny Carson, but my dad was not there. So imagine my dad's surprise when he's listening to Johnny Carson on the radio the next day, and Johnny starts talking about his dinner with some some friends of his parents, the Heckenliveleys, and the joke that he makes was, "My God, they were the oldest people I've ever met." And since I have memories of my grandfather Heckenlively and grandmother Heckenlively, that just struck me as extremely funny. But I want to talk a little bit about what I take away from Johnny Carson's show. If you didn't have the experience of watching The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson had this easy Midwestern charm and sensibility. He was curious about everybody, just a really good human being on the show. Now, off stage, I heard that if he drank, he could be kind of a mean guy. And he had a couple personal problems, but really didn't do that on the show. He was always well dressed. He was always polite. He was funny. He was witty. Just really sort of like everything a man should be. And so for me, that was one of my early, heroes in terms of what it meant to be a good man. What it meant to be a good man was first and foremost to be a gentleman. And Johnny always excelled at being a gentleman. He didn't use foul language. He was kind and courteous. He wanted you to be in on the jokes with him. And it was just a really wonderful experience. And I thought I would read a little bit about Carson, so kind of for the benefit maybe of the younger viewers, but also for some of the older viewers who, as it seems like late night comedy is disintegrating because it's become too crass, too partisan, too political, too tribal. I really want to go back to the beginning, and it really does begin with Carson. And in putting together this show, I want to emulate what Johnny Carson did. That's why the title of the show is "What We Do in Life Echoes in Eternity," because I think that what Johnny Carson did and what he meant to the country echoes in eternity. And it might be a good time to reflect on Carson's legacy and ask if we can't do better. So this is from Wikipedia about Carson, and it says, As host of that nightly program for nearly 3 decades, Carson had an unprecedented influence on a generation of television viewers. And his decision in 1972 to move his show from New York to California was instrumental in shifting the power of the TV industry to Los Angeles. He created such memorable characters as Aunt Blabby and Karnak the Magnificent, as well as a large number of classic skits, and became one of the most beloved performers in the country. Carson won 4 Emmy Awards, was inducted into the Hall of Fame of the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences 1987, and was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom 1992 and a Kennedy Center Honor 1993. On May 22nd, 1992, Carson's final appearance as host of The Tonight Show attracted an estimated 50 million viewers, the largest audience in the program's history. Now, just for a little bit of context, the country didn't have as many people in 1992 as it does today, but Carson was able to attract 50 million people. Let's talk about what a, quote, popular show is today. It'll have like 3 or 4 million viewers. So isn't it time that we asked of our celebrities to engage in behavior which brings us together, makes us feel connected, rather than splits us into warring tribes? So this is from the University of Nebraska, where both Johnny Carson and my dad went. And I thought that this was interesting. So I just wanted to read a little bit about Carson, because I think it's important that we follow those principles that will lead us to success. Because it seems like so much of what's happening in the media today is losing audience participation and viewership because they're not being good to the audience. So listen to this about Carson and reflect on what we do in life echoes in eternity. How big was Carson in the nation's firmament? The comedian and actor Steve Martin remembers him as, quote, certainly the most recognizable person in the United States at that time. His quick wit was legendary and truly the wellspring of his success, set upon a foundation of a lifelong learner's access to science and culture. Over his career, he was as likely to reference Shakespeare or Carl Sagan as he was to sprinkle in a bit of Groucho Marx. During an audience Q&A segment on The Tonight Show in the 1970s, Carson was asked by an audience member, "What made you a star?" In perfect rhythm, Carson deadpanned, "I started out in a gaseous state and then I cooled." After growing up in Norfolk and graduating from high school there in 1943 at the height of the Second World War, Carson enlisted in the Navy. As a commissioned officer at the rank of ensign, he was aboard the battleship USS Pennsylvania in the Pacific when the armistice was signed. While Carson did not fight in war, he did fight on board. On the ship, the wiry Carson developed an interest in boxing, compiling an impressive amateur record of 10-0. It seems he could, even at that age, succeed at nearly everything he set his mind to. So this is something that is another principle that I hope to emulate in this show. I love that Carson was able to mix in profound thoughts from Shakespeare, Carl Sagan, but also to throw in comments from the comedian Groucho Marx. Carson also had genuine patriotism and love for this country. He was interested in pursuing difficult things like boxing. Let me tell you, from the time I've spent in martial arts, it is some of the most challenging things you will ever do. But if you want to live a good life, it's important for you to do hard things. And I think that that is part of the lesson of Carson's life is he may have found it easy to attack other people that he didn't agree with, but he realized that would be unfair and off-putting to people. So What Carson did over his 3 decades in public life echoes down to us through eternity. And for this little boy who sat and watched him with his mother, I remember him so fondly, even though I'm in my 60s. So Carson is gone, but he is not forgotten. And even to this day, he is still influencing people like me. Moving to the second man in my list. This will be somebody that probably very few of you outside of the Bay Area remember, but in my childhood, he loomed very large. His name was Dr. Don Rose, and he was on the AM radio station KFRC. Now, I know the days of radio may be beyond a lot of you, but there was a time when radio personalities loomed large on the American scene. Probably one of the biggest people at that time was a guy named Dr. Don Rose. And I had listened to Dr. Don Rose growing up. He was a bit like Carson in that he just had a fun way, cool way of being as a man. And he also had a Nebraska connection. He was born in North Platte, Nebraska, which is where my aunt and uncle, Uncle Bruce and Aunt Betty, actually ended up living in for their adult lives. And my grandma and grandpa, Heckenlively, lived in North Platte, Nebraska until their deaths. So I was very familiar with North Platte, Nebraska. I lived, when I was a young kid, my family lived in Round Hill Country Club in Alamo, California. And just down the street, one year, Dr. Don Rose, his wife Kay, and their 5 kids moved into a house. And so Dr. Don Rose, who at the time was the biggest local celebrity, lived just down the street from me. I became one of the kids who was always hanging out at the Rose house. And Dr. Don Rose, as I said, was known as that fun, cool guy who was into rock and roll, knew all the music, knew all the artists. He would be irreverent, he would be fun, and you just thought he was the coolest guy you'd ever want to meet. Well, I became a de facto member of the Rose family. I was always over at their house playing with their kids, Jamie and Johnny, and I just was able to observe this famous man up close. What did I see when I observed this very famous man up close? He was just as good in person as he was in public. Even more so than Johnny Carson, who seemed to have a troubled personal life, being married multiple times. It was always clear to me that Dr. Don loved his wife, Kay. And let me just say that as I was growing up, Kay Rose was something of a second mom to me. And so I was able to observe this very famous man up close and to find out that it was possible to also to be very successful on the public stage and also be an incredibly good human being. So for the benefit of most of my audience who has no clue who I'm talking about, I thought I would read this bit from Wikipedia about Dr. Don Rose. Dr. Don Rose was an American radio personality on KFRC AM 610 in San Francisco from October 1973 to 1986. Prior to joining KFRC, Rose had been a prominent broadcaster at WXQI AM in Atlanta, Georgia, and WFIL in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was known for his one-liners, sound effects, and philanthropy. I want to go to, okay, for his broadcasting career. So this is kind of during the time that I knew him, 1973 to the 1980s. I think they lived for a period of years there, and then they moved away. But kind of during my growing up years, Dr. Don was a big presence in my life. One of the things that he did that I thought was really cool is every day on his radio show, he would wish happy birthday to a select number of people. And it was always a big thrill because on most years, he would take some time and wish me a happy birthday over the air so that all my friends who were listening to KFRC, which was pretty much everybody, would know that it was my birthday. So that was just kind of a small kindness that Dr. Don Rose paid to me, for which I was very appreciative. With Rose as morning anchor, KFRC was voted Station of the Year 4 times by Billboard magazine. He was considered by many to be the king of radio in the Bay Area during the final decade of AM's musical hegemony. He was named by Billboard magazine as Disc Jockey of the Year on both the East Coast, while with WFIL in Philadelphia, and on the West Coast, while with KFRC San Francisco. One of Rose's characteristic soundbite mannerisms when he was at KFRC was to state the words "that's right" in a continuous fashion that was intended to sound crazy or funny, which also served to represent the overall morning zoo radio format, style, and feel of his show. Another soundbite that was used often was from a sexy female voice saying, "Oh, Dr. Don, you son of a beep. I'm married to radio," he told the Chronicle in San Francisco in 1975, "and I'm thinking about suing it for non-support. I would describe my show as therapy for myself." During the 1980s, Jane Dornacher worked with him doing traffic. One of his running gags was feeding the dog Roscoe. This would involve Rose telling about what he and his wife Kate ate for dinner the night before, and then Roscoe would eat the leftovers. In addition to his radio broadcasting work, he hosted cartoon shows on field communication television stations in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and San Francisco for over a decade. Dr. Don Rose raised a total of over $10 million by hosting March of Dimes Super Walks for 20 years. As well, he emceed many golf tourneys, including his own, with proceeds going towards Special Olympics and special education. Despite his cheerful persona, Rose suffered over 3 decades of debilitating pain from assorted medical problems. In 1972, he underwent a botched heart surgery, which caused chronic knee infections that required 11 more operations and led to losing his kneecap. He broadcast his daily radio show flat on his back from his home hospital bed for months. In 1984, after a fall made the knee problems worse, he had the damaged leg amputated. Rose had to alter his on-air act in 1986 when KFRC changed its format to big band music and its imaging to Magic 61. He left KFRC permanently by the end of the year. His departure from KFRC was followed by a short stint at KKIS, Concord Walnut Creek, beginning in 1987, where his son Jay was chief engineer. After a failed attempt at buying the station, Dr. Don moved to mornings at San Francisco's K101. 4 months later, he suffered a heart attack while in the air. He did not return to broadcasting on a full-time basis and died in 2005. Okay, so a couple things that were left out of that. the surgical problems which Dr. Don experienced. Well, he went in for open heart surgery in Philadelphia, not knowing that the United States military was conducting biological weapons testing, specifically with a pathogen called serratia, as I recall. Now, this pathogen was supposed to be non-harmful, but apparently it found its way onto the scalpel used to operate on Dr. Don Rose. So this very happy, cheerful man ended up suing the government for their biological weapons program. And as I recall, he won quite a large settlement from them. So just because somebody is happy doesn't mean they don't also understand that our government may do very bad things. And this idea was given to me as a young person that even public figures can suffer from government malfeasance. The other thing that they did not say is, so they correctly said, yes, this problem, this infection, which was caused because of a biological weapons test that the government was performing on its own citizens, resulted in his his kneecap being amputated. They then had to fuse that leg together, and he had to wear a shoe with a couple-inch lift on that because he essentially had a peg leg. So imagine you're a very happy, cheerful man with a peg leg, essentially. Well, one Christmas, as I recall, he took his sons hunting. They were out somewhere. They were crawling over some logs. He slipped between a gap in the two logs, fell backwards, and broke that leg. That required him to be airlifted. I think he was airlifted out. I'm not sure about that. But he had to spend a considerable amount of time in bed, several months, as I recall. So he had this very popular morning radio show. And the question was, well, he needs to be in bed. What are we going to do? Well, what Dr. Don Rose did, with the assistance of the Heckenlively family, was we turned his bedroom into a radio broadcasting studio. I can still remember very vividly working with my mom, putting up comforters on the wall of Dr. Don's bedroom to deaden the sound to make it a radio studio. So it's just, it's a testament to the goodness of a man that not only can he handle success as he did with his show and be a good person, but he could also handle tragedies and obstacles, such as losing his kneecap because of government experiments. And when he got injured and that leg eventually had to be amputated, he still retained his very cheerful demeanor. He was always interested in other people. And it is really a testament to the goodness of Dr. Don Rose that he just he exemplified a life well lived. And it was kind of interesting because many years later, it ended up that I ended up teaching Dr. Don Rose's grandson. Uh, he was a student in my science class. And so I reconnected with John Rosenberg. And so John, his lovely wife, and my wife got together for dinner. And we spent several hours reminiscing about our childhood. And I asked a question that I always did, which is I said, you know, John, your dad always just struck me as the ultimate nice guy. I said, you know, I felt like I was part of your family. So I really was able to observe your family dynamics and see that your family did seem to be as loving as they appeared. I said, was that true? And he said, yes, absolutely. My dad and mom were just wonderful people, and they did so many wonderful things for us. And so it is possible to be a popular celebrity and yet also be a hero to your own family. So that is what I take away from Dr. Don Rose. And it's been half an hour of me talking now. I need another sip of coffee. Moving on to my third figure, good old Rush Limbaugh, who often called himself El Rushbo. Again, this has a connection to my mother because when Rush Limbaugh first appeared on the scene, my mom was one of his earliest fans. I remember very vividly one birthday getting her a subscription to the Limbaugh letter, and she just loved it. She would listen to Rush every day, which meant I was listening to Rush every day. And what I enjoyed about Rush is he seemed to have that Midwestern kind sensibility, but there was also a bit of an edge to him because he talked about political issues and he wasn't afraid of causing a fuss. And so that is another thing I learned about being a man by listening to Rush Limbaugh, which is you can be kind, generous, but also you can point out problems. And so, for the benefit of my younger listeners who may not know a lot about Rush Limbaugh, I thought I would read a little bit about Rush and get you to understand him. So, Limbaugh became one of the most prominent conservative voices in the United States during the 1990s and hosted a national television show from 1992 to 1996. He was among the most highly paid figures in American radio history. In 2018, Forbes listed his earnings at $84.5 million. In December 2019, Talkers magazine estimated that Limbaugh's show attracted a cumulative weekly audience of 15.5 million listeners to become the most listened to radio show in the United States. Limbaugh also wrote 7 books. His first 2, The Way Things Ought to Be, 1992, and See, I Told You So, 1993, made the New York Times bestseller list. Limbaugh garnered controversy from his statements on race, LGBT matters, feminism, sexual consent, and climate change. In 1993, he was inducted into the National Radio Hall of Fame, and in 1998, the National Association of Broadcasters Hall of Fame. During the 2020 State of the Union address, President Donald Trump awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Limbaugh died in 2021 at the age of 70, I believe, from cancer. So there were a couple things about Rush that I try to take into my own life. And in putting this podcast together, I try to take some of those examples from Rush. Rush was not hesitant to dive into controversial issues, but there were a couple things that Rush did that really stood out to me, things that he said. And Rush was a big believer that the mainstream media like to pick their winners and losers, and they like to elevate some personalities and limit the reach of others. And so Limbaugh always talked about how if you really want to be safe, if you want to be powerful, you cannot depend on others to make you a success. You cannot expect the mainstream media to appoint you a winner. And because if you do, then what that means is that they have you on a leash. And if you choose not to do what the mainstream media wants you to do, since they made you, they can also break you. And so, what I learned from Rush Limbaugh is that if I'm attempting to create an audience, I'm going to have to do it the hard way. I'm not going to be able to count on shortcuts. The only way I'm going to make you pay attention to me, the only way I'm going to make myself a figure of any importance is that I have to do the work myself. I can't count on anybody else. But if I put in the work and you tune in, that means I have independence. I have freedom because nobody can take me down because they don't have the power over me. So, in summation, I hope that you will reflect on those individuals who made an impact on you. And then, even though they may be gone, their influence continues long after their death. So, think about yourself. Think about what you are doing with your life and how you hope that echoes in eternity. Thanks and have a great day.